Week 11 of the fantasy season is here, so you know exactly what that means. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in Week 11 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, just two teams on bye week here in Week 11. The Indianapolis Colts, so no Danny Dimes, no Tyler Warren, and the New Orleans Saints, so no Tyler Shuck, no Jawan Johnson. Make sure you guys are checking lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick things off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Jets traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with Justin Fields, or maybe not Justin Fields, but the Jets side of things, as the Jets have been non-committal in terms of who the starting quarterback will be here in this divisional matchup on a short week after Justin Fields was 6 of 11 passing last week, just 54 passing yards. Did manage a passing touchdown, but also an interception, 28 yards on the ground, so he netted just 7.9 fantasy points, and you can't really feel great here. Once again, it's a short week, and this has been a stiff New England Patriots defense all season long. They're kind of just middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. But yeah, you can't feel good at the end of the day going up against what has been a great Patriots team on all cylinders of the football, right? So we look at Justin Fields, Tyrod Taylor, whoever it's going to be. They're just sits for me this week, not risking it. I do think in games where Justin Fields is the starter here towards the end of the season, he will always have the potential for upside because we've seen what he can do, running the football and managing overall fantasy points, but it's just way too risky this week going up against the Pats. So he's a sit. If Tyrod Taylor gets a start, he's also a sit for me. Now, it is a good matchup for rookie tight end Mason Taylor. The one soft spot of this Patriots defense has been against opposing tight ends, but he's 1.4 fantasy points this past week. I just can't do it. He's really only had like those big games against really, really soft defenses like the Dolphins, Cowboys, and Bengals. Once again, if you're really desperate, and I would hate to make this decision for Thursday Night Football for your starting roster, it is a decent matchup, but I'm not risking it. Mason Taylor also a sit for me. The safest start in all this matchup, probably at any position, is going to be Drake May, your quarterback one in fantasy football right now. 270 passing yards this past week against the Bucs, 2 passing touchdowns. Did have an interception, has had an interception in 3 straight games, but when your team is throwing the football at one of the highest rates in the NFL, and even when you're throwing the football with a lot of success, sometimes interceptions pop up, so I'm not worried about it. Has still had 259 passing yards or more in 3 straight games and 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 straight games. And like I said, he's your quarterback one. It doesn't matter what the matchup is, and with that being said, it's a good matchup as the Jets are bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position on the season. I think you could argue this might be a lower ceiling game for Drake May because I think this defense is going to have a lot of success. The running game looked really good this past week, and ultimately this could be a game where the Patriots are in some short field situations and don't really need to throw the football a whole lot due to game script, but still, Drake May an absolute must start. All right, Hunter Henry, just kind of like a risky stream. I mean, he always lives in that streaming category, but I mean, we look since week 5, 9.1 or less fantasy points in every game, 7.7 or less fantasy points in every game, except for the game where he scored 9.1 fantasy points. Like, he's not really getting those red zone looks. He's not really getting that same kind of overall volume we saw in the month of September early in the season, but he's always worth the stream if you guys don't have better options. But really, once again, even though the Patriots are throwing the football a ton, they're getting a lot of different players, mostly wide receivers, involved in the passing game, and that has hurt Hunter Henry as this season has gone on. So he's always a streaming option, but not necessarily my favorite here in week 11 of the season. All right, early Sunday morning, we're going to have an overseas matchup between the Commanders and the Dolphins. Let's start with the Commanders side of things. Marcus Mariota in relief of Jaden Daniels this past week at home against the Lions was a decent enough option. 18.7 fantasy points, 16 of 22, 213 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 22 yards on the ground, no turnovers. So I think here, while these overseas games are always a bit wonky, kind of weird, you never exactly know what to expect, he's a streaming option. I will say the Dolphins defense has kind of quietly been okay the past few weeks. They've been much better against the run, but they are still ultimately a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So it's a good spot. If you guys are desperate for a streaming option, Mariota should be on the streaming radar, but let's not put him any further than that. Then I'll leave Zach Ertz just as a streaming option. 5 targets this past week, 4 receptions, 54 receiving yards, 9.4 fantasy points, and it's kind of on the fringe here, but ultimately the Dolphins have been really bad against opposing tight ends. 714 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to tight ends on the season. So it's a good spot. Ertz hasn't really been playing at a crazy high level. I talked about this going into week 10. The games where Zach Ertz had scored touchdowns, had gotten you double-digit fantasy points, we're all with Jaden Daniels at the quarterback position, but this past week he did see some nice involvement for what it's worth, and he still has had 4 more targets in every game since week 6. So streaming option, but that's it when it comes to Ertz. And then when we look at the Dolphins, I'm just sitting Tua Tagovailoa. He was better, I guess you could say, this past week, but really the run game was the strong suit of the Dolphins. 12.8 fantasy points, 15 to 21, only 173 passing yards. Did throw 2 passing touchdowns, but also 2 interceptions. I will say this much. He's only 21% rostered at the time I'm recording this. Maybe that changes by the time this video comes out, but it is a great matchup. This Commanders defense, bad right now. They've been awful the past few weeks. They're suffering from a lot of injuries, and on the season, they're giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So if you get desperate, Tua could be a streaming option. But once again, I just don't feel great about it at the end of the day. I think that Devon Achane is going to get a lot of usage in this game. So I think it could be an okay real-life game for Tua, kind of like last week, even though he still threw 2 interceptions. But I think ultimately Devon Achane going to see the bulk of the volume overall. The matchup is there, but I just don't feel great about Tua this week. And I really hope with only 2 teams on bye week, you guys aren't forced to start a player like Tua. In terms of the tight end position, there's just nothing here. Waller hurt, Julian Hill hurt, Greg Dulcich didn't do anything hardly this past week, so nothing that we can really trust here. Let's just go ahead and set all Dolphins players at quarterback and tight end here in week 11. All right, let's move into the early window on Sunday, starting with the Packers traveling to face the Giants. Let's start with the Packers side of things, fresh off of one of the slowest Monday Night Football games of all time. Jordan Love was 20 of 36, just 176 passing yards, 28 yards on the ground, 2 fumbles. One of them lost 7.8 fantasy points. He now has 10 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. So I don't feel great about Jordan Love this week. I don't really know how you could. He's had 20 or more fantasy points in 3 games this year, 15.9 or less in every other game. Hasn't thrown a touchdown in 2 straight weeks. So can't feel great here, but the Giants bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks on the season. So the matchup is there. I'll call him a streaming option. Don't want to put him any higher than that. Luke Musgrave, his first game with no Tucker Kraft, 3 targets, 3 catches, 23 receiving yards, 5.3 fantasy points. It was a tough matchup. The Eagles' defense good against opposing tight ends, but the Giants' defense better against opposing tight ends. So not a great spot this week. Musgrave, just going to be a sit for me. I don't really know. You look at the upcoming schedule, there's not really any soft matchups for tight ends coming up or fantastic matchups. So Musgrave, going to be on that high alert if you're hurting at tight end, keep an eye on him kind of area, whatever, right? But just not starting him at this point in the season. All right, then moving to the Giants side of the things. At the time recording this, Jackson Dart still not ruled officially out for week 11 of the season, listed as questionable. But yeah, I mean, technically speaking, he's been evaluated for a concussion 4 times on the season so far. I think the best move here is for Jackson Dart to not play in week 11, but I don't know. I'm not a coach of the Giants. And speaking of that, they have a new interim head coach for the meantime. So there's a lot of question marks around the Giants offense going into week 11. At least they're at home. But yeah, this is a tough matchup against the Packers, who have had some weaknesses on this defense, but ultimately giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Not a great spot here. If Jackson Dart plays, though, I think you got to roll with them. He's been absolutely fantastic as the starter for the Giants when it comes to fantasy points scored. But then you do kind of worry so much of his fantasy output comes from running the football. 54 or more rushing yards in every game except for 2 as the starter, and a rushing touchdown in every game as a starter except for 1 game. So, I mean, I think some of that could slow down now with these, concerns, and like this team already so banged up in terms of their star players, Cam Scadabo, Malik Neighbors, and then like they're going to try and bring in a new head coach this offseason. Like they want these guys healthy. This young core could be really good if they're all healthy and on the field in the coming season. So I don't exactly know how to look at Jackson Dart, but if he plays, is good to go. I think you got to roll with him. He's been way too good. If it's Russell Wilson, if it's Jameis Winston, I'm not doing it this week. They're going to be sits for me. And then you kind of wonder here, the Giants on the road against the Lions in week 12, on the road against the Patriots in week 13, before that week 14 bye week. This could be a really tough stretch for any Giants player involved. But with that being said, Theo Johnson, still solid this past week, 14.5 fantasy points, 8 targets, 7 grabs, 75 receiving yards, 14.5 fantasy points. Got to be on the streaming radar. And, this past week, it was the Bears. So, I mean, you got to feel good against that defense. And the Packers haven't been great against tight ends, but they have moved up against the position in terms of their rankings. Still bottom 12 against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed, but it's not the worst matchup by any stretch. But then again, like Theo Johnson, Jackson Dart had a good connection. What is it going to look like if we get another quarterback on the field? Not quite sure, but I'll still leave Theo Johnson on the streaming radar here in Week 11. Moving along, we got a lot of divisional matchups here in Week 11. Let's take a look at the Texans traveling to face the Titans in what is probably not going to be the most exciting game in Week 11, but let's take a look here because CJ Stroud remains in concussion protocol at the time I am recording this, so we might get another week of Davis Mills at the quarterback position, who had pretty good success this past week. 28.6 fantasy points. Was one of the higher scoring fantasy quarterbacks in Week 10. Threw the football 45 times, 27 completions, 292 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Did have an interception, but also added 20 yards on the ground and a rushing touchdown. Technically had a fumble, not a lost fumble, but still a really good fantasy day. With all that being said, I still have him as a sit. I don't quite know that I trust him. It's not the worst matchup here against the Titans, who are 20th overall, bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So it's still a good spot here at the end of the day, but I don't know. I just don't really see a tremendous amount of upside. Maybe this is like an unfair call here, but something about this matchup, Texans, Titans, like I just don't feel good about it. I don't feel like it's going to be a game with a lot of points scored and like fantasy goodness. I think there's going to be more of the Texans defense and like Woody Marks having success in this matchup. But Davis Mills, for what it's worth, did get a lot of targets to Dalton Schultz and Nico Collins this past week and kept that game and that win against the Jags very competitive. So, and then on top of that, we don't even know if Davis Mills is going to start this week or if CJ Stroud is going to be able to play. So if it's Stroud, he's definitely a sit. I'll just put this out there. If you guys are still listening, Davis Mills could be a desperation in a super flex or double quarterback league. But other than that, I just don't think it's worth it. We'll see how things shake out. All right, Dalton Schultz, though, I do think is a good streaming option. 18.3 fantasy points in Week 10, 11 targets, 7 grabs, 53 receiving yards, and a touchdown. We talked a lot about him last week, talked about him on this previous week's waiver video as well. And ultimately, I think he's a really good streaming option going into this matchup. But the Titans have been okay against opposing tight ends, top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed. So not the greatest matchup. And if it was a better matchup, I honestly probably have him as a start because he's been that involved in the passing game. Like it's basically Nico Collins, then in terms of the wide receiver too, it's like somebody different every single week between these Texans wide receivers, and then it's Dalton Schultz getting the volume in the passing game. So I do like him, but not the greatest matchup. And once again, the game script here, like I just don't know how high scoring this one's going to be. Then we move to the Titans. This is going to be straightforward. Cam Ward is a sit every single week, as he's been every single week of the season here on the channel. Tough matchup against the Texans. They give up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. This is not a good spot for Cam Ward and the Titans offense. Chicken Conquo, 3 fantasy points the last time we saw him in action. He's also a sit. Don't feel good about any Titans offensive starter here in Week 11 of the season. Moving along, we got the Panthers, who will travel to face the Falcons. So let's start With Bryce Young in the Panthers side of things, a whopping 2.56 fantasy points in Week 10 for Bryce Young. I don't know that we really need to break a whole lot down here. 17 to 25, 124 passing yards, an interception, a lost fumble, 6 rushing yards. It baffles me that, believe it or not, over the past couple of weeks, there are still people out there saying that Bryce Young is like a streaming option. He's not. He shouldn't even be rostered. He's rostered in 18% of leagues. He should not be rostered, even in like super flex leagues. This is Dynasty. Bryce Young doesn't need to be rostered. It's just not going to happen. We're looking at 10 or less fantasy points in every game since Week 7. He's had 19 or more fantasy points in 2 games this year. Week 2 against the Cardinals. Week 6 against the Cowboys, arguably the worst defense in the NFL. So I guess kudos in that Week 2 matchup against the Cardinals. He played pretty well, but outside of that, we are looking at 13 or less fantasy points in every game. It's just been bad, and this Falcons defense looked really good this past week. Don't get me wrong, the Panthers did have success in Week 3 against the Falcons, but it all came through the run game and their defense. Bryce Young, just 11.6 fantasy points in that game. So on the road here, the Falcons defense coming off of this Falcons defense bad against the run, but they are good against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So for this video, Bryce Young, definitely a sit. And the tight ends, I'm not even going to waste your time going over them. They are both sits as well, moving into Week 11 of the season. But bear in mind, with all that being said, as much as I don't like the Panthers this week, I do think that Rico Dowdle is going to have a really good game because this Panthers run defense is bad. So there's still some hope for the Panthers, but I just don't think through the passing game that's going to happen. All right, Michael Penix, I just don't trust him. I don't, We considered him a okay streaming option last week, and 12 of 28, 177 passing yards, 8 touchdown, 10.9 fantasy points. The Falcons did have a lot of success running the football against the Colts in that overseas matchup. Tyler Algier, Bijan Robinson, the duo there that frustrates a lot of fantasy managers. They were very good against the Colts, and ultimately there's still a nice connection between Penix and Drake London going on. But this Panthers defense, they're not great, but they're certainly not bad. The 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Overall, this is just not really a matchup where I think that Michael Penix is going to have a high ceiling. And we only have 2 teams on bye week, and a lot of you guys aren't even rostering Tyler Shuck, so you're really just looking at Daniel Jones. There's some injuries out there at quarterback, but at this point in the season, you've probably overcame that on your roster. So I don't really think we need to risk streaming Michael Penix. He's just going to be a sit. I was pretty close to calling Kyle Pitts just a sit at this point, but he still remains in the risky streaming radar because the Panthers do struggle against tight ends, a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position, but 5.8 fantasy points this past week, 7.8 the week before. It's just tough to really call on a week-to-week basis what we're going to get out of Kyle Pitts, but I'll leave him on the streaming radar just because, once again, the Panthers do struggle against the tight end position. Let's move along to the Bears traveling to face the Vikings. Let's start with Caleb Williams and the Bears side of things. I've encouraged you guys just to kind of ride this wave of Caleb Williams. It hasn't been good at times, but over the past 2 weeks, it's been very rewarding. 25 fantasy points in Week 10, 20 of 36, 220 passing yards, 8 passing touchdown, 63 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. This week, he will get the Vikings, who have fallen back a little bit in their rankings against quarterbacks. Right now, they're 18th in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position, so not great, and this is a big divisional matchup. The Bears just kind of have, they're having one of these seasons. They just pull out wins. They tend to have some upside on a week-to-week basis. So I like Caleb Williams still. He's a top 10 quarterback overall in fantasy. You got to like him if you own him. Maybe the ceiling is not always there. Maybe I should argue the floor is not always there, but there is a ceiling. There is upside. So I like Caleb Williams this week. We look to the tight end position. Colston Loveland, one of the most added at tight ends after that Week 9 breakout, but I talked a lot about this past week. I think Loveland was startable this past week, streamable, right? We talked a lot about this, but Week 9 was the Bengals. This team is historically bad against tight ends. Okay, they have 5 more receiving touchdowns allowed than any other team in the league. 12 total allowed. The next highest would be 7 receiving touchdowns allowed. So they are really bad against tight ends. And I kept telling you guys, the Giants are better against the tight end position. I don't know exactly what his upside is going to look like, but he did get involvement. 4 targets, 4 catches, 55 receiving yards, 9.5 fantasy points, and the Vikings a bottom 10 unit against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position. So it's a good enough spot that I'll leave Colston Loveland on the streaming radar, but it depends on who you guys have. Cole Kmet really seen a decrease in volume, especially since coming out of the bye week for the Bears. He has not had more than 2 targets in a game, and actually on the season, he's only had more than 2 targets in 2 games. So he's not going to be an option. He is a sit. Then let's take a look at the Vikings players here. JJ McCarthy, I will leave in the streaming category as the Bears are a bottom 6 team in terms of fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. Did throw 2 interceptions this past week, but he still was pretty decent throwing the football. 20 of 42, 248 passing yards. Threw a touchdown as well, had 48 rushing yards. So, a rushing touchdown in week 9, 48 rushing yards on the ground this past week. At least 25 rushing yards in his first 2 starts and a rushing touchdown in that stretch. So he does offer a little bit of rushing upside as well, which is nice. But yeah, really what we're looking at here is that he's facing the Chicago Bears. So you got to feel good about that. He has bumped up to 42% rostered, but it's the Bears. The Vikings are at home. The Vikings have kind of shown they're going to fight against these teams. Kevin O'Connell is a head coach. They're certainly not throwing in the towel and ending the season. He's got a lot of playmakers to throw to. He's faced the Lions and the Ravens in the last 2 weeks and has shown some success. So I definitely like him as a streaming option against the Bears this week. Then TJ Hawkinson probably should be in the risky streaming category. So my apologies there. That's really how I view him. His volume has not been good the past 3 weeks, 3 or less targets in 3 straight games. And really, he's just been wildly inconsistent, has only scored double-digit fantasy points twice on the season. So I will be honest, I don't view him as anything more than a risky streamer. But once again, it's a good enough matchup against the Bears, bottom 10 unit against opposing tight ends on the season. So could definitely see there be an involvement in terms of the passing volume this week for Hawkinson, but probably closer to a risky streamer, I think McCarthy is a solid streaming option, though, as we move into week 11. Next up, we got the Chargers traveling to face the Jaguars. Let's start with Justin Herbert and the Chargers side of things. I think Herbert, a really solid option. Obviously, if you own him, you're going to roll with them. I don't know if there's a ton to break down here, but I do want to talk about him because they only had 14.7 fantasy points this past week, so there could be somebody out there kind of doubting him, but this is a great matchup. This is a bottom 5 unit now in terms of the Jaguars fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks, so a good spot for Herbert on the road here. You got to imagine this game's going to be pretty competitive as the Jaguars are still quietly a pretty good team. I know they just lost to the Texans in kind of a baffling way, but this is still a competitive team for sure. So I like Herbert this week. I think he can bounce back to kind of those higher ceiling games that we were getting out of him the previous 3 weeks. Only threw 1 touchdown this past week, but once again, the way that game was going, it was just a weird game. The run game was having success. It wasn't super high scoring. Didn't really feel like the Chargers needed to throw a lot, but at the same time, it kind of felt like they did. It was a weird game. The defense was having a lot of success, obviously. So ultimately, I think Herbert will be better this week. It's a good matchup. He's a top 5 quarterback in fantasy. Nothing else we need to talk about. Okay, Arondé Gadsden, a little banged up this past week with a quad issue. Looked like a knee issue at first, or maybe an ankle issue, but it's a quad issue. He's considered day-to-day with a bruised quad. So don't know if he's going to play this week, especially since the Chargers are on bye week in week 12. But ultimately, the Jaguars have fallen way back against the tight end position. They now have given up the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So if he plays, I got to leave him in the start category, but I would be a little bit nervous with him coming off of that injury. If it's any other tight end, we mostly saw Tyler Conklin this past week. Will Dissly was a healthy scratch, but that led to just 1 target and 1 catch for Conklin. So any other Chargers tight end, just going to be a sit here in week 11 if Gaston is out. Then we look to the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence, just 10 fantasy points this past week. Can't feel good here. Threw an interception, threw a touchdown, 2 fumbles. One of them lost, 158 passing yards. That's it. 35 yards on the ground, and now he gets the Chargers, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. So I don't even want to stream him. I don't want to risk it. he can always do something. We know that he's one of these quarterbacks that will pop up, have good games, but he's also a quarterback that's wildly disappointing. So I'm just going to sit Trevor Lawrence here in week 11. Brenton Strange, designated to return from IR. He could play this week. I don't want to start him. And if it's Hunter Long or Johnny Munt or anybody else, I also don't want to start them. Hunter Long didn't play this last week, so we actually saw Johnny Munt, who had 2 targets and 1 catch. So Brenton Strange, definitely keep a close eye on, because he is a player who we've seen be productive, and when he's back and healthy in the mix, could be an option to potentially pick up if you guys are hurting at tight end. But here in week 11, just going to be a sit as we approach the weekend. All right, moving along, we have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Bills in one of the more exciting matchups here in week 11. Let's start with Baker Moneymaker Mayfield. Came back to true form in week 10 in a very competitive matchup against the Patriots. 28-43, 273 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, no rushing yards, no turnovers, 22.9 fantasy points. You got to feel good if you own Baker. He's still a top 12 quarterback in fantasy. And I talked a lot about this going into week 10. Like, yeah, it's not the greatest matchup against the Patriots, but it will be a competitive game script, and that's going to force the Bucs to throw the football a lot, which they are good at, even when they have a lot of injured pass catchers. It's a tough matchup this week against the Bills. Technically a tougher matchup, as the Bills have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. But once again, it's going to be a competitive matchup. Baker will find a way to get it done. I still believe in him being a week in, week out starter in fantasy, even if the previous 2 games before that week 9 bye week were very disappointing. You own Baker, just keep rolling with them. I think he's a solid start this week. Cade Otton, atop of the streaming radar, 12 targets this past week, 9 grabs, 82 receiving yards, 17.2 fantasy points. But the Bills have given up the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and on the season, they have allowed 23 receptions to tight ends. That's it. 242 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown. This is not a great spot for Cade Otton, but he is seeing the volume. So I do like him. He's basically the 3rd pass catcher on this team. You could even argue he's really the 2nd pass catcher, but right now it's Egbuka, Tez Johnson, Cade Otton. Those are the names here. So I do like Otton this week, but it is a really tough matchup. All right, you are starting Josh Allen every single week as we switch to the Bills here, no matter what. 20 fantasy points in week 10, 2 passing touchdowns, an interception, 306 passing yards, 31 yards on the ground, and a lost fumble. Yeah, the Bills lost, whatever. They're going to move on to week 11, fire it up. This is a good spot. Once again, competitive matchup. Don't really care about the individual matchups here, but the Bucs just kind of middle of the pack against quarterbacks. You're rolling with Josh Allen. We don't need to break it down any further than that. Now, Dalton Kincaid, right when we thought he was healthy and in a good spot against the Dolphins, he suffered a hamstring issue, and now he is considered week to week. I think there's a high chance he does not play this week. But if he plays, he's going to get the involvement. It's a competitive matchup, good game script. So I think you can roll with him. But if you're worried with him coming out of the injury, having another injury issue just, in week 6, not that long ago, that's fine. I'm not going to talk you guys into starting Kincaid, but the volume should be there if he does play. If he doesn't play, we're going to see a mixture of a Dawson Knox and rookie Jackson Hawes. Hawes did score a touchdown this past week, but that was his only catch. Dawson Knox had 3 catches. So now these guys had double-digit fantasy points. Of course, anyone can get involvement here. Anything can happen, but I'm just going to set any other Bills tight end here in week 11 if Kincaid does not play. All right, final game of that early window, we will have Joe Flacco and the Bengals traveling to face Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers, a little rematch of the Unk Bowl that we got back in week 7. Let's take a look here, as we have not seen the Bengals in action for a week coming out of their bye week. 32.7 fantasy points. The last time we saw Flacco at quarterback, he threw 4 passing touchdowns and 470 passing yards against the Bears. So I don't think Flacco's a streamer. I mean, maybe he's only 53% roster at the time recording this. He'll probably get an increase coming out of this waiver period by the time this video comes out. But Flacco's just a start for me. I don't really care who he's playing. You got to feel good here. Now, the Steelers' defensive line, their front 7 has been playing well, getting after the quarterback as of late, but this is still a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. The secondary looks really, really bad right now, so Flacco's got to be a start. We look at him with the Bengals, 18.7 or more fantasy points in every game, 2 or more passing touchdowns in all those games. He's a start for me going into the week. It is a good matchup for the tight end position as well, but Mike Gesicki's on IR. I'm sorry, he shouldn't even be on the screen, so that really just leaves Noah Fant, who has been like on the streaming radar, so I guess you could take a look here if you guys are hurting. That's my mistake. I mean, Gesicki on IR, Noah Fant, and a good matchup here. If you guys are really hurting, Noah Fant's only 8% rostered. He has scored 2 touchdowns in the last 4 games, so one of those being against the Steelers, so ignore what's on the screen. Hopefully you guys are listening. Let's call Noah Fant a risky streamer here in week 11 of the season. Gesicki obviously not going to be an option. All right, then we look to Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers. Things have not been so pretty offensively the last 2 weeks. 8.4 fantasy points this past week, 16 of 31, 161 passing yards, had a passing touchdown, but 2 interceptions and a fumble. Now, he gets the Bengals this week. It is a really good matchup, okay? They're giving up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So if you're in like super flex, double quarterback, you don't have better options. Sure, roll with Aaron Rodgers, but I still think in a majority of single quarterback leagues, we don't need to consider Aaron Rodgers this week. But let's just talk about this real quick. The last time these two teams faced, obviously, it was very good. Rodgers had 4 passing touchdowns, his second best fantasy mark of the season with 24.5 fantasy points. Flacco had a huge game. It's not always smart to just look at the previous matchup for a divisional game and expect to get the same exact results, but Steelers are at home this week, so Rodgers, I think he's a sit, but he's close to a streaming option. And like I said, double quarterback, super flex, you can consider him. And maybe I've been a little bit too harsh in terms of my start sits for this matchup, but we'll see how it shakes out. All right, I do have Pat Freiermuth and Jonnu Smith in the streaming category. You're really going to be flipping a coin here. Freiermuth has been a lot more involved over the past 3 weeks or so, and don't forget, Darnell Washington sees some involvement as well, but I just put these guys as streamers because, once again, this Bengals defense historically bad against tight ends. 12 receiving touchdowns allowed on the season, 722 total receiving yards allowed, and 61 receptions on the season. So this is a good spot. I don't really know who's going to have more success. My guess would be Pat Freiermuth, but they are both at least streaming options due to the matchup here in week 11. All right, let's move into the afternoon slate of games, starting with the Niners traveling to face the Cardinals. Let's start with the Niners. Another week, another conundrum when it comes to injuries at the Niners facility and team, the quarterback position and other positions. All the reports are still very unclear about what is happening with Brock Purdy and this injury. My assumption at this point is that Mac Jones is going to be the starting quarterback in week 11. So I'm going to call Mac Jones a good streaming option. He has risk. He's been very inconsistent, but I think he's a good enough option if you guys are hurting at the quarterback position. 24 fantasy points this past week, 319 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and an interception. So I think Mac Jones, fine. If it's Brock Purdy, I think he's also fine. He's had 18.7 or more fantasy points in the 2 games he has played in on the season. So once again, I think it's going to be Mac Jones getting the start this week, but if it is Purdy, they're both just perfectly fine streaming options. George Kittle got to be in the start category. We're not really seeing any involvement over the past 2 weeks to Jake Tunges. He's had 0 targets and has been on the field for 6% or less of snaps. So he's not really going to be somebody we talk about unless we see another injury to Kittle. Kittle, on the other hand, 23.4 fantasy points, 9 targets, 9 grabs, 84 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And the Cardinals defense a bit wishy-washy. They're not great against tight ends, though 17th overall against the position. So not the best matchup, but certainly not the worst here. Kittle, come on. If you own him, you're going to roll with him at this point in the season. Then we look to the Cardinals. Going to keep Jacoby Brissett, the brisket man himself, in the streaming category. And this is kind of like the Joe Flacco situation. He's very close to just being a start, and this is a good matchup. I mean, he's had 19.4 or more fantasy points in all 4 starts with the Cardinals. I mean, the Cardinals often struggled this past week, and he was fine in terms of fantasy, 22 of 44, 258 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 31 yards on the ground. Has had some fumbling issues, a fumble in 3 straight games, 2 lost fumbles this past week, but the fantasy production is there, at least 2 passing touchdowns in every start, and like I said, 19.4 more fantasy points. So one of my favorite streaming options, and this Niners defense is banged up. They have moved back to being a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks. So I like Jacoby Brissett a lot this week. I think he is a really solid streaming option and very close to a start. And then obviously Trey McBride, if you guys own him, you got to roll with him. And he has really benefited with Jacoby Brissett being the starting quarterback. He's had a touchdown in every game with Brissett at the quarterback position. And that has moved Trey McBride up to the tight end 1 on the season, where he definitely wasn't on that pace with Kyler Murray as the starting quarterback. 16.5 or more fantasy points over the last 4 games for Trey McBride, and 21.2 or more fantasy points in 3 of those games, a touchdown in 4 straight games. You got to feel good here, regardless of the matchup, and it is still a pretty good matchup against a depleted Niners team. So Trey McBride, you're already rolling with them anyways if you own him, but he's an absolute must-start, no doubt about it. Next up, the Seahawks are traveling to face the Rams in what's going to be a really good divisional matchup, two of the best teams in the NFL right now. Let's start with Sam Darnold. What do we do with him? 5.9 fantasy points in week 10. What? 10 of 12, a passing touchdown, 178 passing yards, and an interception. -2 rushing yards, 2 lost fumbles. What's going on here? I mean, it just really wasn't a game script where he needed to do anything else. The fumbles were not helpful by any stretch. Don't forget, I mean, in week 7, he only had 9.6 fantasy points. Bye week in week 8. Absolutely shredded the Washington Commanders in week 9. So we've seen a lot of inconsistency here. Then this Rams defense, I mean, they're nothing to sneeze at. The 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. This is going to be a really good measure of where Sam Darnold is at the quarterback position at this point in the season. And don't forget, last season was great. MVP caliber season last year. Then at the very end of the season, kind of fell off, to say the least. But I'm not saying that's going to happen this year. I still believe in Sam Darnold. This is going to be a really good game here, so I'm going to leave Sam Darnold in the start category because I like the potential for the game script here. But bear in mind, maybe he does hold some risk moving into week 11. A.J. Barner, really bad week this past week, 0.3 fantasy points, 0 targets, 0 catches. So I'm going to leave him as a risky streamer, but definitely not my favorite. He has had double digits in every game this year except for 4. So he's still in the streaming category. Still at double digits in week 9. They do find some creative ways at times to get A.J. Barner involved. So risky streamer, but more of a true desperation streamer. All right, Matthew Stafford, Matthew Staff infection himself. 4 or more passing touchdowns in 3 straight games. Okay, we do not bench Matthew Stafford at this point in the season anymore. Okay, 26 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, and we've been talking about this for a strong period of the season. We've been really high on Stafford. 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game this year except for 2. 18 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 3. So Stafford playing at a true MVP caliber rate right now. It's a tough matchup against the Seattle Seahawks. This defense has looked really good as of late, but they're actually not as high up against quarterbacks as I thought. 19th overall against the position. So they are definitely allowing some garbage time results as well. But he's got playmakers. Devontae Adams a bit banged up, but there's still enough options. It's a great offensive system. Let's not waste any more time. You own Stafford. You are starting him. Higbee has been seeing slight involvement, but not enough to where I would consider starting him. So he will be a sit at the tight end position moving into week 11. Next up, the Chiefs are traveling to face the Broncos coming out of their bye week in what will be a heated divisional matchup here. Let's take a look here at Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. Patrick Mahomes, your quarterback 2. Obviously didn't see him play this past week, but he has held up on the fantasy season. He's been fantastic. Even with a poor week 9 performance fantasy-wise and being on bye week this past week, still has the second most fantasy points scored of any quarterback. So I'm going to leave him as a start. I know he gets the Broncos this week. They've given up the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so could see a lower ceiling. And the Broncos have this tendency to play pretty well against Patrick Mahomes. They're on the road here, so it may depend on who else you have, but I still have a tough time calling Mahomes anything other than a start. Tons of offensive weapons. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Travis Kelce. The run game has been frustrating for fantasy, but it's been okay in real life. So Mahomes got to be a start for me. Travis Kelce, I've said it for weeks and weeks now, continues to be a start. Once again, only 12.6 fantasy points in week 9, which isn't awful, but certainly not great, I guess. On bye week this past week, tight end 5 in both full and half PPR. You just got to keep rolling with him. Keep taking the punches here. He's a solid start. Yeah, it's a tough matchup. Broncos 8th against tight ends, but still, Kelce is looking at 10 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 3. He's been fantastic. You could say whatever you want about Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift, whatever. I don't care. He's productive in fantasy still. He's not washed. You can consider him a start. If you have other options, you don't like the matchup, that is fine. All right, Bo Nix. Low-end start for me this week. And I don't want to be too overreactive to this past week, but the Chiefs coming out of their bye week, great defensive coordinator, extra time to prepare. Bo Nix, 7.8 fantasy points this past week. And if you watch that game, which most of us were forced to as it was a Thursday night game, something was not clicking. And I'm a Bo Nix truther, a Bo Nix believer, and I keep reminding you guys, he had some pretty bad games last year, and we're kind of on a similar trajectory here in the 2025 season. Like, we're going to get some Bo Nix performances where you're kind of like, what is this? But I think he'll be okay this week. He's still the quarterback 6 in fantasy on the season, so I'm not going to call him a sit. I don't think he's a streamer. I think he's still a start, but the upside could be capped. But listen, the Broncos will get a bye week in week 12. Then he gets the Commanders. Then he gets the Raiders again, and I think those will be better performances before he gets the Packers, which could be tough. The Jaguars probably solid. Then he gets Kansas City again on the road to wrap up the fantasy season. So, yeah, there could be some lower ceiling games here, but I still think the upside is always present with Bo Nix available at the quarterback position. So I'm still going to call him a start, but maybe like a low-end start. Evan Engram, I moved out of the streaming category to just a sit. He's had double-digit fantasy points once this year. 1 touchdown on the year. That was the game he had 13.3 fantasy points against the Eagles. Every other game, 9.9 or less fantasy points, 3.2 or less in the past 2 games. I just have no interest in starting Bo Nix, in Evan Engram. I think he's way too risky, so I'm just going to call him a set, especially against a Chiefs defense that's allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season. All right, next up we have the Ravens, who are traveling to face the Browns. Let's start with Lamar Jackson. Kind of a lower ceiling week for him in week 10 against the Vikings. 16.6 fantasy points with 17 of 29, 176 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, just 36 yards on the ground. So it was kind of nice to see him. He ran the football 9 times, only 36 rushing yards, but at least he was running the football coming off of that, recent hamstring issue where he only ran the football 5 times in week 9. He didn't look as limited this past week. But what do we do here? This Browns defense, nothing to sneeze at. The 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. The last time these two teams played, 26.3 fantasy points for Lamar Jackson. Now, this game's on the road, but yeah, I'm not worried about Lamar. If you own him, just roll with him. And if this game is another kind of lower ceiling game, he's going to get the Jets, the Bengals, the Steelers, the Bengals in the following weeks. This is still Lamar Jackson, an absolute must-start player. Let's keep him in our lineups. I'm going to go ahead and just leave Mark Andrews in the start category. Did score a touchdown this past week, kind of saved his fantasy day, but 10.4 fantasy points, and since Lamar has been back, he's had a touchdown in each of those 2 games and at least 10.4 fantasy points. So once again, here's not the greatest matchup. Browns are top 10 against the position, but if you got Mark Andrews, he's one of Lamar Jackson's favorite targets, so I keep rolling with him. Isaiah Likely just hasn't had the fantasy production this year. He is a sit. Now, I've got Dillon Gabriel as a sit, but I think he's really interesting. If you guys are really hurting at quarterback, this Ravens defense is improving. The defensive line play has been better. They're getting healthier. But they're still a bottom 10 unit against quarterbacks, and Dillon Gabriel was pretty good this past week. 20 fantasy points, 17 of 32. But still, only 167 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and kind of increased his value with 54 rushing yards. That was easily his highest mark running the football on the season. Don't know if that's going to carry over into week 11. He also had no turnovers, no interceptions, hasn't had a fumble on the season. So, just one of these games where it was kind of a safe stat line, and he found a way to kind of elevate to fantasy relevancy. I don't know if that's going to bleed over, so I'm leaving him as a sit. But once again, if you guys are really desperate, super flex, double quarterback, he's an option. You could throw a dart at the wall here. He does like to throw the football to the tight end position. David Njoku, just 2 catches this past week, but he did score a touchdown. Harold Fannin on the other end, 8.4 fantasy points. He had 7 targets, but just 4 catches. 44 receiving yards for Fannin. So we look at it here. The one position the Ravens have been pretty good against all year long is the tight end position. And yeah, there's opportunity for Njoku and Fannin on a week-to-week basis, but it seems to be a bit inconsistent, so they're always streaming options. But due to the fact that we got 2 tight ends at play here, I'm just going to call them risky streaming options moving in to week 11. All right, Sunday Night Football, we got the Lions traveling to face the Eagles in what's going to be one of the best games of the week. Definitely going to see some offense in this one. Should be a competitive game script. Let's start with Jared Goff. 24.8 fantasy points this past week, his second best fantasy performance of the season. 320 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, no turnovers. So you got to feel pretty good here if you own Goff, but bear in mind he just faced the Commanders defense, which is bad, and now he's facing the Eagles defense, which is much better, giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, and just had a pretty dang good defensive performance on Monday Night Football. So still like Goff, should be a good game script, should be competitive, all that stuff. So I'll leave him as a start, but like Goff is such a weird fantasy player. Top 12 quarterback on the season in terms of fantasy points scored, but 19.3 or more fantasy points in 4 games, 16.8 or less in every other game. So just bear in mind he has these weeks where the ceiling is just not there, but this game should be competitive, so I do like Goff this week. Laporta, I'm going to leave as a start. 10.3 fantasy points this past week, 5 targets, 5 grabs, 53 receiving yards. Once again here, it's not a good matchup. The Eagles have been very good against tight ends this year. Just 284 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. Top 5 against the position, so tough spot. But once again, the game script should be good here, so I'll leave Laporta in the start category as we have done most weeks on the season. Then we move to Jalen Hurts. I think he's going to be like one of these players a lot of people overreact to going into the week because it was just not there against the Packers, but this is a good matchup. The Lions have not been good against quarterbacks, just allowed a good game to Marcus Mariota. Bottom 12 against the position in terms of fantasy points allowed him. This is Jalen Hurts. It happens at times. It happened last year, but we have 2 games on the year with 12 or less fantasy points, including this past week for Jalen Hurts. Every other game in the season, 19.4 or more fantasy points. Top 8 fantasy quarterback on the season. Yeah, this past week, 183 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a lost fumble, 27 yards on the ground, 15 and 26. That was it. But still, you own Hurts. I do think you should feel good going into this matchup, especially at home. And plus, we look at the upcoming schedule. I think this is a good game script, a good matchup this week against the Lions. Then he gets the Cowboys. Then he gets the Bears. Like, we're going to see good Jalen Hurts over the next couple of weeks, so don't freak out. Dallas Goedert, I'm going to leave him in the start category. I was actually expecting a better game against the Packers this past week, but I started like Josh Jacobs and Devonta Smith. I think we were all expecting better games out of everyone involved for the most part, but he still had nice overall volume. 6 targets, 4 grabs, 43 receiving yards, only 8.3 fantasy points, but still, he's really involved in this offense at the end of the day. He gets red zone looks. He's only given you single digits twice on the season. Every other game, 10.9 or more fantasy points. So Goddard, even in a tough matchup because the Lions have been pretty good against tight ends, but they've actually moved back just a little bit in their rankings. But once again, game script, offense, it's all going to be there. Let's go ahead and roll with Dallas Goedert as well here in week 11. All right, to wrap things up, we have the Cowboys coming out of their bye week to face the Raiders on Monday Night Football. Let's start with Dak Prescott. Last time we saw him in action, a bit disappointing. 16.4 fantasy points, 24-39, 250 yards through the air, a touchdown, a pick, 34 yards on the ground. But gets the Raiders this week. They have moved up in their ranking against quarterbacks pretty significantly, but I feel good here. I think if I own Prescott, top 10 quarterback in fantasy, coming out of the bye week, extra time to rest, prepare, still has weapons and Lamb, Ferguson, Pickens, a good run game. So I'm going to leave Prescott in the start category, and the Cowboys kind of hovering there, like close to 500, right outside the playoff race. Like they're going to try and really bring their all over these next couple weeks. They got a tough schedule. Raiders, not so bad this week, but then they get the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Lions, the Vikings, the Chargers. Commanders, not tough to finish out the fantasy season, but still, the Cowboys, when they're losing, they're going to throw the football a lot. So Prescott got to be a solid option. And I think Jake Ferguson still going to be a start for me. Once again, the Raiders are actually quietly very good against tight ends, but Ferguson gets the involvement. Only 8 fantasy points this past week. He had that fumble, which kind of screwed his stat line, but he did have 7 targets, 5 catches, 50 receiving yards. So still feel good about Jake Ferguson. I still think he belongs in the start category. And then to wrap it up, we got Brock Bowers. we'll talk about him. I guess we'll wrap it up with the Raiders quarterbacks. But yeah, do you feel good about Brock Bowers right now? I don't know. Had the best fantasy performance of any tight end this season in week 9, and then followed it up in week 10 with 3 targets, 1 catch, 31 receiving yards, and 3.7 fantasy points. But, you know, I mean, he went from the Jaguars to the Broncos. Very, very tough matchup in comparison there. This week, he will get the Cowboys. And yeah, this Cowboys defense is quite bad. But they're okay against tight ends. That has been the one position where they don't absolutely suck. So with all that being said, I'm still starting Brock Bowers if I own him. Michael Mayer really hasn't seen enough involvement, but he has seen some involvement, but not enough to start him. I think Bowers can bounce back any week, regardless of the matchup, regardless of what's going on at quarterback. So let's just leave Brock Bowers in the start category. But I did kind of talk about this earlier in the season. Like, we had a nice week 1 against the Patriots, who have not been great against tight ends. Then the following 3 weeks, although he was banged up, weren't super encouraging. No double-digit fantasy performances. Then he missed some time. And I was worried about him coming out of the bye week, and then he absolutely exploded. But still, there's been inconsistency with Brock Bowers on the season. So move with caution, but the upside is there. If you own him, you can roll with him and feel good. All right, Geno Smith, a quad contusion at the time of recording this. Don't know if he's going to play or not play this week. Don't know if Kenny Pickett's going to play or not play. I don't really care. They are both sits for me, and I'm not going to break it down any further than that. Any Raiders quarterback, it is a good matchup. Don't get me wrong. The Cowboys have been awful, giving up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks, but even in super flex, even in double quarterback, are you going to risk Kenny Pickett or Geno Smith in your starting lineup this week? I'm not. My answer is sit both of them here in week 11. And there you guys have it. Every single quarterback, every single tight end, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 11 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it really does me a huge favor. Helps out the channel tremendously if you guys subscribe on the way out and hit that like button. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, go check out all of our week 11 fantasy content. We have everything here on the channel that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So go check out all the videos for the week as they drop. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.